Welcome to Counterpoint. I'm Tanya Granick-Allen. Since Russia invaded Ukraine, many cities have been devastated, millions of refugees have to be resettled, and tens of thousands are reported dead. It seems on one hand, the entire world is wrapped up in this conflict, and yet on the other, many seem to have relegated this conflict to the back of their mind. But what happens with Russia and Ukraine will have major consequences throughout the world. Already, we are seeing the price of resources like oil increase. Russia is, after all, the third largest oil producer in the world, and we have seen access to Russian natural gas threatened. Russia accounts for 41% of all natural gas imports to the EU, with even some countries almost exclusively depending on that Russian gas. And of course, there is the humanitarian crisis, and it's expected during any war when there's large civilian populations. As of September, there are more than 7.4 million Ukrainian refugees across Europe. 81% intend to return home to reunite with their families. But is that possible with the war still raging on? What will there be when they do return home? Will their homes even still be standing? Joining us now to help unpack the Russian-Ukraine war is Dr. Alistair Edgar, Associate Professor of Political Science at Wilfrid Laurier University, with cross-appointment to the Balsillie School of International Affairs. Thank you, Dr. Edgar, for coming on today. I really appreciate your time in helping us unpack this very complicated issue. So it has been several months since, in a few months, it'll be almost a year since Russia invaded Ukraine. And many thought that Russia initially would pummel Ukraine very quickly, but the Ukrainians have very valiantly fought back. What was this surprising to you?
The Ukrainian resistance?
Yes.
Yes and no. Yes, in the sense that I'm sure everybody thought at the time that Russia might take Kiev, might take government institutions, and indeed, that's what they were planning in quite rapid order. I think within 2 to 3 weeks, when that was clearly not taking place, then it started to look like the lightning strike plan was unraveling for Putin. So by that time, and the response from Zelensky, his famous, "I don't need a ride, I need ammunition," all that sort of stuff in the background. By that time, it looked like this was going to be extended more. I still didn't think it would be ongoing nearly a year later.
Yes, it has definitely been quite a conflict. And I think many around the world are surprised, especially many in Canada, that this is still waging on. And again, we have short memories in this country, or many people do, and it's a natural thing with humans. Do we recall, was there ever a stated reason as to why Russia invaded Ukraine? Has that motive since changed?
Yeah, I mean, Putin has a stated reason. I think at the same time, his stated reasons need to be taken with a sack of salt. His stated reasons were NATO encroachment or NATO enlargement, and talk about denazifying Ukraine. And those were his official reasons or excuses. But he has in other places talked about wanting to reassert or reconnect the old Russian Empire, the Soviet Union, or even the pre-Soviet Union Russian Empire. And he's talked about Ukraine's non-existence as a separate people and as a separate state. So he has a range of motives depending on who you ask on what day.
And with respect to the NATO expansion, because that seemed to definitely dominate the airways when there was discussion as to, was that an impetus as to why they came in? Was that a provocation? Where do things sit with NATO expansion since the start of this conflict?
Well, interestingly, in that sense, what Putin has achieved is the exact opposite of what he said he wanted. Because since the invasion, both Finland and Sweden have applied for membership of NATO, and both were not NATO members previously. Finland, of course, had experienced an invasion from the old Soviet Union in the late 1930s. So now NATO expansion is actually continuing apace with 2 potential new members, both having applied for accession to NATO. Obviously, the Ukraine case continues on, the war is going on, and we will see after the conflict what the status of Ukraine will be. But yeah, NATO enlargement has actually sped up because of Putin's invasion.
My goodness. Okay, well, we're going to pick up this issue right when we return from this commercial break. Please stick around. Welcome back. We're having an update on what's happening with the war in Ukraine, with the Russian invasion. It's been, can you believe it? We're coming up to almost 1 year. And joining us to help us unpack what's been going on the last several months is Dr. Alistair Edgar. Thank you again for joining me today, Dr. Edgar. We know that, well, actually, let's do an update first. So it's been, again, 10 months. Where do things sit now? You mentioned in the first segment that, you know, it looked like Russia was, well, at least they were definitely attempting to, and they seemed like they were almost going to take Kyiv. They did not. There was a lot of encroachment in eastern Ukraine. Where have the Russians encroached now, and are they still holding that land, or has Ukraine taken it back?
Actually, Ukraine has done, from a Ukrainian perspective, incredibly well in resisting Russia. Obviously, Russia failed to take Kyiv. The Ukrainians pushed them back all around Kyiv, right up to the Russian border. And then in the south, Donetsk, Luhansk, the Crimea area, and Kherson, all in south and southeast Ukraine. The Ukrainians have really been pushing Russia all the way back. They've liberated Kherson, which is the first major city that the Russians had taken, had occupied. They've liberated that, and now they're starting to press Russia. Geopolitically, they're pushing them across the river. They're looking for weak spots. There are small Russian incursions in some, literally now fighting for little villages.
Wow.
But the Ukrainians are really chasing the Russians south and out.
My goodness. And when the Ukrainians are taking back their territory that was occupied, that was taken over, and they're reclaiming it, what are they finding? Are villages and towns, are they entirely razed? Are there a lot of victims of this war?
Absolutely. During the attack, the Russians' approach was just carpet bombing or carpet artillery, wiping out everything in front of them. And they really rely on heavy artillery and other missile attacks. So enormous infrastructure damage, just total destruction. And as the Russians have been pushed out and the Ukrainians have come in, they're also starting to find lots of examples of torture, of arbitrary execution of civilians, and of forced deportation of Ukrainians, including the Ukrainian children who've been essentially stolen and deported back to Russia.
Oh, that's devastating. Of course, there's always casualties, there's always devastation in war, and you always think of the children and what the lasting impacts will be on them. To have children stolen is just it's an abomination. Anyhow, with the conflict, so with seeing Ukraine's strong resistance to taking back, and again, it was unprecedented, but I think a lot of the foreign member states, we came in, especially with NATO, and really helped bolster a lot of their supplies, because to go up against the Russian military is quite an accomplishment. How has foreign funding factored into this conflict?
Considerably. I would say there's two things. You may know, or you may remember, that the Ukrainians immediately said, women and children need to evacuate, and you'll be talking about refugees, but that men, especially fighting age men, should stay, should not leave Ukraine, should stay. So in actual personnel terms, oddly enough, the Ukrainians have more men in uniform in Ukraine than the Russian forces do. But Russia has the heavy artillery, the bombardments, all of those things. And that's where foreign support has come in. Direct funding to buy weapons and buy supplies, but also then actual equipment on the ground. So people who've been following that probably know the HIMARS, the US surface-to-surface missile systems, Stinger shoulder-fired missiles, howitzers, tanks, armored personnel carriers. A lot of that equipment has been given to Ukraine, and they are fighting back as much as they can. What they don't have is what I'd call medium to longer range equipment, missile systems that can reach into Russian territory. And NATO has been very careful in that sense about giving them short and medium range defense capabilities, but not the longer range defense capabilities.
And why? We have about 30 seconds before commercial, but why has NATO been very careful?
The concern has been that Ukraine would use these to strike into Russian territory, which might escalate Russian threats. Putin waved nuclear weapons around. I think that's been exaggerated. So now there's a move to give them more longer range weapons.
Okay. Well, we're going to pack more of this conflict when we return in just a few moments. Please stick around.
Yep.
Dr. Edgar, thanks again for joining us. We hear of the strong resistance by the Ukrainians against the Russians, but contrary to that, or in converse to that, we see many headlines in global newspapers of, it seems a lot of Russians seem to be defecting, or there's an inability to recruit more men, or they're just not willing to go and fight on behalf of Russia. Maybe they don't believe in the cause. What do you make of all of that?
When the initial Russian invasion took place, there wasn't much criticism. As it strung out a little bit more, and as Vladimir Putin talked about mobilization, that's when a lot of several tens of thousands of military age Russians fled Russia to try to get away. Now he's talking about further enlargement, further expansion, and I think as his invasion has started to fail, as Russians are seeing more of the costs of that, not in their own economy, but in terms of their lives being disrupted and potentially men going to the front lines. Now there's a lot more resistance, but still, again, criticism of the invasion can put people in jail for 10 or 12 years. And in fact, describing it as a war or an invasion could bring with it a 10 or 12-year jail sentence. So Russians in Russia are very careful about what they want to say.
Oh, my goodness. Now, we think of oil and gas. There's been suggestions that Europe is going to freeze because they're so dependent on that Russian oil and gas. What is the state of some of these pipelines? Is Europe, which again has such a great dependency on Russian oil and gas, will they freeze this winter, or what are they doing to shore up other supply?
Yeah, they've actually, since the invasion began, Europe as a whole, Germany was the most dependent, but Europe as a whole has actually reduced its dependence very significantly on Russian liquefied natural gas. So right now, the EU is saying they have reserves to get through this winter. They're not worried about whether Russia cuts off oil and gas supplies to Europe for this winter. They are looking at, in fact, reducing their dependence on Russian energy supplies to zero by 2025.
Wow.
Because no matter what happens in this conflict, and ideally Ukraine wins and Russia gets pushed out, but no matter what happens in this conflict, I think the new mood in Europe is that you cannot rely on or expose yourself to dependence on Russian energy supplies, full stop. So that's a real change.
Now, assuming that there is that full cutoff by 2025, obviously that would render Russia somewhat, I would say, impoverished. I mean, they rely on a lot of that income, a lot of that revenue, to a lot of their exports to, keep their wealth. What would that mean for Russia then if Europe were to say no more?
It will hurt Russia to some extent. In fact, recently, since the invasion began, India has been increasing its purchase of Russian energy supplies. And a couple of months before the invasion, China and Russia had officially met. Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin met and declared a no boundaries alliance between the two. So it may be that they can continue to will sell increasingly to China and India, sorry. But that also can change. That also makes Russia more dependent on those two countries and their leaders.
Yes, and who knows how that would end. What do you think Canada should be doing? As there's been talk of perhaps greater Magnitsky sanctions. Have those been how should those be employed? Should there be something else Canada should be doing?
Yeah, I think we've done almost as many targeted sanctions as we can possibly imagine. On individuals, some more sanctions are coming. Military aid, financial aid to Ukraine still is important. On a very practical sense, and I was thinking about this last night, obviously now Russia has hit Ukraine's hydroelectric and thermal power. So they're trying to use winter as a weapon against the Ukrainian population. So getting very granular, generators, power generators, warming equipment, anything in large supplies, large numbers to provide power to local Ukrainian communities would be very valuable. On the other side of it, Russia has mined or booby-trapped vast areas as they're being pushed out of cities. They're putting mines, landmines, and explosives into things like children's toys. So I believe Canada just announced another $15 million in support to demining efforts in Ukraine.
My goodness.
Because there will be, before you can rebuild, you have to get all of the booby traps and the landmines out of the way.
Welcome back. We're wrapping up our discussion on the war in Ukraine with Russia's invasion. And joining me again is Dr. Alistair Edgar. Dr. Edgar, in that commercial break, I couldn't stop thinking about what you had said about grenades and other being placed into children's toys. Why? And I know this sounds like a strange question to ask, but I have to ask it. I can't get that visual out of my head. Why would anybody put a grenade in a child's toy? Why would one put landmines when we know how destructive they can be on the countryside?
Well, there's two things. They used cluster munitions, which are illegal, as area denial weapons to try to disrupt the population and disrupt troop movements at the same time. But now that they're being pushed out of villages, they are booby trapping, entrances, hallways, individual rooms. Part of it, I think, is frustration, anger. They're being beaten. And so they want to try to take out their hatred. And that literally can involve putting explosives into the stuffing of children's toys or, under soccer balls or indoor frames to try to make it as difficult as possible for Ukrainian forces as they're coming in and to make it as difficult as possible for the Ukrainian civilian population to try to rebuild their lives.
It definitely builds a lot of fear if you're trying to return home and you're living in constant fear that you don't know where the booby trap is and when things will explode. Absolutely. That would be very jarring. Let's talk about that humanitarian crisis. We only have about 3 minutes left, but this to me is the most important thing, is how are the Ukrainian refugees faring?
The Ukrainian refugees actually are doing, in a sense, quite well. Of course, being a refugee doesn't mean you're doing well. But when they entered the European Union, rather than having to apply for refugee status, because there's, literally millions having to leave Ukraine, the European Union granted them a special status. So not refugee status, but a temporary visa, 12 months, and it can be renewed for another year, so up to 2 years. So they didn't have to go through, we call them refugees, but in international law, they're actually not refugees. They are Ukrainians who've been given a temporary visitor status, if you will, in the European Union. So I think you mentioned earlier, Tanya, most of them want to go back, and that's always the case everywhere where people are forced out. They don't want to leave their homes. They're literally forced out. So the vast majority of Ukrainians want this war to come to an end with victory for them so that they can go back in safety to where they live. Mm-hmm. Others have obviously moved overseas. I know here at Laurier and at the University of Waterloo, we have a good number of Ukrainian students and some faculty who are now here studying and have been granted positions and opportunities to study. They also want to go home, but they've come further afield. Smaller numbers, but several tens of thousands have come to North America as well.
Well, that's nice that they can continue their studies. Obviously, war disrupts lives and destroys lives, but it's nice that at least some can kind of pick up where they left off, at least academically, even if it's in another continent. So we hear about the ones in North America. Otherwise, are most of the refugees, or they're temporarily then just staying in Europe, waiting for things to simmer down, then they can return?
Yeah, the vast majority. Poland was the first place that a large number of them came to. So a vast majority are in Central and Western Europe and will stay there until they can go home, because they want to go back to their lives, to their communities. A danger that some of us have watched out for with the mass refugee or mass movement of people is the problem of trafficking, because women and children are vulnerable to being trafficked on the borders. So that was another issue, that the safety of displaced Ukrainians, especially women and children, has been a priority issue at the border and once they get into Europe.
Okay, and Canada, I assume we're still helping a lot of the refugees come here temporarily, maybe permanently?
Yeah, we're still doing that. Obviously, we have, across Canada, particularly in the prairies, but significant Ukrainian communities here as well. So yeah, we're hosting Ukrainians, not to the numbers that Europe are. But again, most of them, certainly the Ukrainian students that I work with, they want to continue their studies and then they want to go home.
Yes, and I appreciate that, especially if you feel like you've been forced out or you have been forced out of your home. You don't want the other side to win, and you want to reclaim your territory. And I appreciate that.
And for some of them quite literally have told me one issue is they don't know whether the building they lived in still exists. I mean, their infrastructure is just being destroyed. So they want to go back. They're waiting as some of the areas are liberated to find out whether places actually exist.
Okay, Dr. Edgar, thank you so much for your time today. Appreciate it.
Happy to talk to you. Thanks, Tanya.
Thank you.